fundamentals of IT security. Sometimes you'll see this referred to as the AIC triad to differentiate it from the federal organization in the US called the Central Intelligence Agency. But since it's so easy to remember CIA, we often refer to the CIA triad instead of the AIC triad. But keep in mind that the CIA triad has nothing to do with the CIA being the Central Intelligence Agency. The C in the CIA triad is confidentiality. We want to prevent someone from gaining access to private information. We need to provide that information in a confidential way. The I in CIA is the integrity, where if we're sending information from one person to another, we want to be sure that the recipient really is receiving exactly what was sent from the origination. And lastly, the A in the CIA triad refers to availability. Obviously, we want to be sure that all of our systems remain up and running at all times, even if we're implementing some type of IT security. You'll often see the triad written as a triangle, and each leg of the triangle has the confidentiality, the availability, and the integrity listed as the security objectives associated with the triad. One of the biggest challenges we have in IT security is making data available to others, but making sure that availability is only to the right people. We refer to this as confidentiality. One way that we provide this confidentiality is through encryption. We can have one person encrypt data, send it to someone else, and that other person can then decrypt that data to be able to see the original plaintext. Obviously, anyone in the middle who happens to get access to that encrypted data has no idea what's on the inside, and if they were to look at that data, they would not be able to discern anything important from that information. Another common way to provide confidentiality is to set limits on what someone may have access to. We commonly do this with access controls. We can limit who might have access to certain types of information. For example, this might allow someone in the marketing department to be able to see all of the marketing presentations and be able to make changes to those, but it would prevent all access to any of the accounting information of the organization. And if you've ever had to provide additional authentication factors when logging into a system, that's another type of confidentiality. Someone would not be able to access an account unless they had the proper authentication credentials, and adding those additional factors provides more confidentiality. When we're receiving data from a third party, we'd like to be able to verify that the data that we have received is exactly the same data that was sent and that nobody has made changes to that data while it was traversing the network. We're able to do that by using methods of integrity. One way to provide integrity is by hashing. The person sending the data will create a hash of the data and send you both the data and the hash at the same time. When you receive the data, you'll perform the same hashing function, and if your hash matches the sender's hash, then you know the data that you've received is exactly the same as the data that was sent. We can enhance this integrity by including a digital signature when we're sending data, which takes a hash and encrypts it with an asymmetric encryption algorithm. This means that we can check to make sure that none of the data has changed, and we can confirm the person who sent the data. That provides an additional level of integrity that could be important if you're sending very sensitive data. It's also common to use certificates to be able to identify devices or people and provide additional factors of integrity, especially when you're transferring data from one device to another. And lastly, we have the concept of non-repudiation. This means that we have proof of integrity, and we can confirm without a doubt that the information that we've received really did come from the originating party. If you've done any work in information technology, you know how important it is for your systems to be available. Availability is that leg of the CIA triad that ensures that people have access to the data that they'd like to view. One way to provide this availability is to have systems that are designed to always be up and running. We might combine this with a system that has fault tolerance, where we have multiple components, and if one of those components fails, the other component can pick up and continue to operate normally. And of course, if you're concerned about systems being available, you'll constantly need to make sure that they are managed and updated by patching those systems. This ensures that the systems are always as stable as possible and that we can close any existing security holes, preventing someone from gaining access through some type of exploit. Someone would not be able to access an account unless they had One of the important foundations of cryptography is ensuring that when someone sends data to a third party, that third party is able to verify that that information really came from the sender. This is something that we think of all the time as part of a contract. We sign a contract at the bottom, it's our name, it's our signature, and if somebody was to look at this contract later, they could see our signature and could reasonably say that the contract was signed by us. Just like our signed contract, we have a similar set of features in cryptography. And today we'll look at how this non-repudiation works using proof of integrity and using proof of origin with high assurance of authenticity. Proof of integrity means that any data that we've received, we can verify that it's exactly the same data that was originally sent. This means that our data is accurate, consistent, and we know that nothing inside of the data we've received has been changed. In cryptography, we can accomplish this by using a hash. A hash is a short string of text that we can create based on data that is contained within the plain text. This is sometimes referred to as a message digest or something like a fingerprint. This means that if anything changes with that data, we'll have a different fingerprint or a different hash. This is the same as an actual fingerprint. If the person changes, you'll see that the fingerprint is very different. Although a hash is very good at verifying the integrity of the data, it doesn't associate that data with a particular individual. We can verify that the data that we've received is exactly the same as the data that was sent, but we can't verify who sent the data. However, there are ways to provide that additional integrity. We'll talk about those in just a moment. Let's see how this hashing works by using a practical example. There is an organization called Project Gutenberg on the internet, and they have published the Gutenberg Encyclopedia. I downloaded volume 1 of that encyclopedia, and it's 8.1 megabytes of data. And then I ran an application that took all of that data and created a hash or a fingerprint of that particular encyclopedia volume 1. And here is the exact hash that I've created from that volume. Now, if I was to change one character inside of that file anywhere, although the size of the file is exactly the same after making the change, somewhere in that haystack of data, there is some type of difference. But it would be very difficult for a human to read through all of that data, 8.1 megabytes of text, and somehow determine where that individual change might be. But if you perform a hash of the changed data, you'll see that the hash value that I create is very different than the hash value that was original. So if I have downloaded this file, perform my own hash, and compare it to the original, I can see that something has indeed changed with this particular volume 1 of the Gutenberg Encyclopedia. At this point, we might want to download again to see if we happen to get a corrupted or modified version, or perhaps we perform a diff or a comparison between those two files to see exactly where the change might be between the original version of the volume 1 and the version that we received. By using these hashes, we're able to provide proof of integrity. We know if anything was changed when the information was sent from the original sender. But we can also add to this an additional level of integrity called proof of origin, where we can verify the person that sent the data to us. Sometimes you'll see this referred to as an authentication when we are looking at the source of the message. By using a digital signature, we provide non-repudiation. So not only do we know the person that has sent that data to us, but anyone else could examine this transaction and verify that the information we received really did come from the sending party. Just as someone can use a pen and paper to sign a contract and send it to you, in cryptography, we use a digital signature. This digital signature uses a private key that is only known to the person who's sending the data. No one else has a copy of this private key. To verify that private key was used, we use the public key associated with that private key, and that way we can assure that the information we received is not only the same as what it was sent, but we know that it had to be sent by the person who provided the digital signature. In practical terms, adding a digital signature to a document is usually created by clicking a box that says add a digital signature, and a lot of cryptography happens behind the scenes. Let's lift the hood a little bit and see what that process might be that's taking place when you check that box to add a digital signature. We'll start with a conversation that's occurring between Alice and Bob. Alice is sending a message to Bob that says, "You're hired, Bob," and the first thing that Alice will do is provide a digital signature before she sends it. The first thing that happens when she clicks that checkbox for the digital signature is that a hashing algorithm creates a hash of that plain text. In this case, the plain text is, "You're hired, Bob." Once that hash is created, we now need to have some way to verify that it really came from Alice. And since Alice is the only one with her private key, we're going to encrypt that hash with Alice's private key, take that encrypted hash, send it along with the plain text so that Bob is going to receive a message that says, "You're hired, Bob," and then attached to that message is a digital signature. In most cases, Alice is going to send that message over to Bob using email or some other type of electronic delivery. Bob is going to receive exactly that message that was sent. It says, "You're hired, Bob," with the digital signature included with it. Bob is going to use Alice's public key, which is a key available to anybody, and he's going to examine the digital signature and decrypt it using that public key. Once that decryption takes place, we have the original hash that was created of that plain text message. And at this point, Bob wants to see if the hash that was in that digital signature matches the hash of what he received. So he's going to perform the same hashing function that Alice originally performed. Bob is going to take the original plain text, run it through the same hashing algorithm to come up with a hash of what he received. Bob can now do a comparison to see if the hash that was included with the digital signature is the same as the hash that he manually created from the plain text. And if that matches, we not only know that the information we received is exactly the same as the information that was sent, but we know that it had to be sent from Alice. As I mentioned earlier, this entire process of creating a digital signature and verifying the digital signature is something that's usually created through clicking a button on your screen, or it's something that happens automatically. You normally never see this process occur, but having an understanding of the digital signature process and the verification of the digital signature process can help you better understand the integrity that we're looking for and the proof of origin that's so important when working with transactions like this. We're all very familiar with the login process. You put in your username, your password, there might be some additional authentication factors, and if all of those are correct, you gain access to resources on that system. This process begins with identification, where you claim to be a particular user on that system. The check between your username, your password, and the other authentication factors is referred to as authentication. This proves that we really are who we say we are because we knew the secret password or we had some additional authentication factors that we could use to help prove that we are that person. Now that we've identified who we are, we now need to determine what type of access we have, and that's done through authorization. If we're part of the shipping and receiving department, then we should have access to systems that should only be available to shipping and receiving, and we should not have access to information that might be in the finance department. And of course, all security systems need to have a log of exactly what happened. So we need to know what time someone logged in, how much data may have been sent or received, and what time this person logged out. We refer to this entire system as the AAA framework, and this refers to authentication, authorization, and accounting. Let's have a look at a practical example of using AAA. We're going to use the example of logging into a VPN server. In this case, it would be a firewall or VPN concentrator in the middle. You're on one side of that concentrator, and you need to use AAA to gain access to an internal file server. So we'll start with our client on the internet, and we'll access the VPN concentrator, which prompts us for a login. So we're going to provide a username and password and send that information over to the VPN concentrator. The concentrator itself doesn't have any information about usernames, passwords, authentication factors, or anything else. And in most organizations, all of that information is stored on a central server, and we refer to that as a AAA server. This AAA server is going to receive the request from the VPN concentrator asking if the username, password, and other information that was provided matches some type of user in the database. And if the match is true, it sends back information to the concentrator and says those credentials are approved. At that point, the concentrator knows that we really are the person we claim to be, and it allows us access into the internal file server. As a security professional, you'll be responsible for managing the security on hundreds or perhaps even thousands of separate systems. And in many cases, you'll never have physical access or even be able to see where those systems might be because they may be located anywhere in the world. So the question now becomes, how can we verify that a computer trying to connect to our network is a computer that's authorized to be on our network? This computer by itself obviously can't type a password to prove who it might be. And in most cases, you probably wouldn't want to store a password on one of your systems out in the field anyway. So how can you really confirm that that system is allowed to be on our internal network? How do we provide that additional authentication? In many cases, we use a certificate that we put onto this device that is digitally signed, and we check that authentication during the login process. This allows anyone needing to provide that verification with a way to confirm that that really is a company-owned laptop. This could be on a VPN concentrator so that it can verify that the devices coming into the network really are company devices, or perhaps it's management software that can validate that end device that may be either on our local network or anywhere in the world. The process for creating the certificate is relatively straightforward, but the one thing that you must have in your environment is something called a certificate authority, or a CA. This is a device or software that is responsible for managing all of the certificates in our environment. On the CA itself, you would create a certificate just for that laptop. That certificate is now digitally signed by the certificate authority so that later on we can verify that it really is an original certificate from our certificate authority. Now we put that certificate on the laptop, and anytime we want to perform an authentication, we can use that certificate as an authentication factor and verify that it really was digitally signed by the certificate authority. So as part of your security infrastructure, you would have a certificate authority. That certificate authority itself has its own certificate that was signed by a root CA. We also have our laptop in the field, and we have previously created a device certificate just for this machine, and it has been signed by the CA. Once we know the CA certificate and we know the device certificate, we can then compare these two certificates, and we can see that our device certificate was signed by the certificate authority that we trust in our security infrastructure. Now that we've gone through the authentication process, how do we authorize that device to have access to resources within our network? We would do that by using an authorization model. And there are many different authorization models to choose from. We have a big list of these later on in the video series in section 4.6. We would commonly authorize users and services to have access to certain types of data and applications. The challenge here is, how do you create this relationship in a form that's able to easily scale for tens, hundreds, or even thousands of users? In many environments, we accomplish this by taking the users and services and putting an authorization model right in the middle before you access the data and the applications. These are commonly defined by roles, organizations, attributes, and many other types of characteristics. Let's say that you had no authorization model at all. We would create a series of rights and permissions where the user has rights to access the resource. The problem is that this doesn't scale very well. Let's take an example of somebody in the shipping and receiving department. This is someone who needs access to a large number of systems, a lot of data. Maybe there's tracking information, shipping labels, databases of customers, and we would create separate rights and permissions so that anytime this person logged in, we would need to give them rights to create a shipping label, track a shipment, view monthly shipment reports, access customer data, and perhaps anything else they need for their day-to-day operations. Now, if this is the only person in shipping and receiving, this is a relatively easy process. But what if you're part of a larger organization that has has tens or hundreds of people in shipping and receiving, you can see it would be difficult to take every single user account and manually set up rights and permissions for every single resource that they need access to. In this case, there's only 3 resources, but imagine if there were tens or hundreds of resources, you would need to set those up for the tens or hundreds of users. You can see now why this would be very difficult to scale. To be able to scale, we would need to use an authorization model. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as an abstraction that allows us to separate the users from the information they're trying to access. This greatly streamlines the process of administering these large number of users or large number of resources, and we can support a very, very large infrastructure just with a very simple set of abstractions. Here's how this would work. We'd have the same user in shipping and receiving, and we will add them to a group called shipping and receiving. We set this group up originally so that anybody added to the shipping and receiving group would have access to create a shipping label, track a shipment, view monthly shipment reports, have access to customer contact information, and anything else you would need in shipping and receiving. Now let's add in our tens or hundreds of users. Instead of manually mapping every single user to the individual authorizations they need, we just simply add all of the users to the shipping and receiving group. With this one single addition, we can give tens or hundreds or thousands of users access to the resources they might need, regardless of how many users there are and regardless of how many resources they need to access. Shipping and receiving. Now let's add in our tens or hundreds of users. Instead of manually mapping every single user to the individual authorizations they need, we just simply add all of the users to the shipping and receiving group. With this one single addition, we can give tens or hundreds or thousands of users access to the resources they might need, regardless of how many users there are and regardless of how many resources. Hear this referred to as an abstraction that allows us to separate the users from the information they're trying to access. This greatly streamlines the process of administering these large number of users or large number of resources, and we can support a very, very large infrastructure just with a very simple set of abstractions. Here's how this would work. We'd have the same user in shipping and receiving, and we will add them to a group called shipping and receiving. We set this group up originally so that anybody added to the shipping and receiving group would have access to create a shipping label, track a shipment, view monthly shipment reports, have access to customer contact information, and anything else you would need in shipping and receiving. Now let's add in our tens or hundreds of users. Instead of manually mapping every single user to the individual authorizations they need, we just simply add all of the users to the shipping and receiving group. With this one single addition, we can give tens or hundreds or thousands of users access to the resources they might need, regardless of how many users there are to the shipping and receiving. We would need to give them rights to create a shipping label, track a shipment, view monthly shipment reports, access customer. As the name implies, a gap analysis is a study of where we are versus where we would like to be. And in the world of IT security, we are constantly performing gap analyses to be able to understand exactly what security is going to be needed in the future. Although this is very simple to explain, it's a relatively complex process to perform the analysis of what's actually going on in your environment and putting together a plan of how to get from where you are to where you're going. As you might imagine, trying to understand every aspect of IT security and how it applies to your organization can be a very involved process, and this is something that commonly takes a number of weeks, months, or even years to compile. As you can imagine, this might involve a number of different people in your organization, and there is an extensive project plan with emails and data gathering and anything else that's needed to compile the information about what's happening with security in your environment. Before starting the gap analysis, it's useful to have a baseline. This gives you something to work towards and an idea of where the goals should be for your organization. There are a number of different baselines to choose from, and some of these baselines have been specifically created for certain organizations. For example, your organization may be following a set of baselines from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. They publish a document called the Special Publication 800-171 Revision 2, and the title of that document is Protecting Controlled Unclassified Information in Non-Federal Systems and Organizations. You might also use a baseline that was created by the International Organization for Standardization and the International Electrotechnical Commission. This is the ISO IEC 27001, or the Information Security Management Systems. And of course, you could create your own baselines based on your specific needs as an organization. These baselines will commonly involve an analysis of the people in your organization and the processes you use for security. When evaluating people, you might want to get a better understanding of their formal experience in information technology security. You might want to understand what kind of training they've received, and you might want to see if they have a knowledge of specific security policies and procedures that you can use in your organization. Even with the right people in place, you'll still want to be sure that you're following the correct policies for IT security. This might start with an evaluation of the existing IT systems and how they relate to your formal policies that have been created in your central security policy documentation. The analysis portion of the gap analysis will begin with a comparison of the existing systems that you have running in your environment and to identify any weaknesses that those systems might have. You can also compare these weaknesses with the most effective processes for understanding how to compensate for those weaknesses. Ultimately, you'll create a detailed analysis where you'll look at very broad categories of security and then break down those broad securities into individual smaller segments. Here's a good example of how you might start with broad understanding of a process and then breaking it down into individual pieces. This is the document 800-171 revision 2, which is protecting controlled unclassified information. And this is a table that maps the access control requirements to the security controls that are in place. For example, this page shows access control, where you would want to limit system access to unauthorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users, and devices. This account management covers a number of different individual security controls. So when we start to break this down, we can look at user registration and deregistration. We need to understand how user access provisioning is handled, understand the management of privileged access rights, a review of the user access rights, and so on. By looking at these broad areas, we can now break down individual security tasks to see how well we're handling the processes and procedures for each of these individual steps. Once we've gathered all of this information for all of our processes, all of our devices, across all of our different locations, we need to create a final document that summarizes everything that we've discovered. We can start with a comparison that looks at the detailed baseline objectives and gives a perspective of where we are today versus where we would like to be with each one of these objectives. Perhaps the more difficult question to answer is how you get from where you are to where you'd like to be. This path to get from where we are to where we'd like to be commonly takes time, it takes money, there may be equipment that we need to purchase, and obviously there's change control so that you can implement these changes in your environment. Once we have all of this information compiled and the plan of how we can get from where we are to where we'd like to be, we can create a final gap analysis report. This report not only includes the information about where we are today, but it also provides that pathway so that we can understand what it's really going to take to move forward into the future. All of the recommendations you have about meeting this baseline will be documented in this gap analysis report. Here's an example of one of the tables that you might include in your gap analysis report. On the left side, I have a series of system requirements, and all of those system requirements were broken into smaller pieces in the detailed part of the report. But we might want to get a much broader understanding about all of our different remote sites and how they are compared to the ultimate baseline that we would like to reach. For example, our organization might have 7 different locations, and we've performed a gap analysis across all of these system requirements for all 7 of those locations. The locations that are relatively close to meeting the baseline, we can mark with a green color. Anything that might be in the midpoint, we can mark as yellow, and locations that need a lot of work to be able to meet our standardized baselines will mark with red. So if we wanted to have the biggest impact on improving our security, we may want to start with the locations and security requirements marked in red, and then move to the ones marked in yellow, and then finally the green. The report obviously will include extensive details about why these colors were used and provide a summary of how we can implement security controls to better meet the goals of these baselines. In many networks, you'll find that once you're through the firewall, the inside of the network is relatively open. People are able to move from system to system without any type of checks or balances. There are relatively few security controls in place, and this not only allows authorized individuals to move anywhere they'd like, but also allows unauthorized individuals and malicious software to do the same. But many security administrators are changing their network to be zero trust. This means that you have to authenticate or prove yourself each time you want to gain access to a particular resource. This applies to every device on the network, every process that's running, and every user on the network. As the name implies, with zero trust, nothing is trusted, and everything is subject to some type of security checks. This means you might be using multi-factor authentication during your login process. You may be encrypting data that's stored and encrypting data as it's traversing the network. There may be additional system permissions or additional firewalls that you're installing, and there are a number of different security policies and different controls that may need to be added to create this zero trust environment. One of the ways that we can start examining and implementing zero trust on our networks is taking our security devices and breaking them into smaller individual components. We commonly refer to this as separate functional planes of operation. So whether it is a physical device, a virtual device, or a security process that's running in the cloud, we can apply these different control planes to every single one of these security controls. Broadly speaking, we can look at these as having 2 different planes of operation. One of them is the data plane. The data plane is the part of the device that is performing the actual security process. So this might be a switch, router, or firewall that's processing frames, packets, and network data in real time. The data plane on these devices is processing any forwarding, network address translation, routing processes, or anything else that helps move data from one part of the network to another. But of course, all of this movement of data needs to have some type of management and control, and we perform that control in the control plane. This is where we manage all of the actions that are occurring in the data plane. This means we may be configuring policies or rules for a device to determine whether data may be traversing the network, or maybe we're setting up a forwarding policy or understanding how routing may be configured. So anytime you're referencing a routing table, you're looking at a firewall rule, or understanding how network address translation should be handled, you are configuring in the control plane. One way to get a better understanding of the data plane versus the control plane is to see how this might be implemented on a physical device. Here we have a physical switch, and we want to be able to break out the different planes of operation. Down at the bottom of the switch are all of the different interfaces that are used to move data from one part of the network to another. And as we've already seen, all of the traffic that we're forwarding all happens on the data plane of the device. But of course, this device needs to have configurations. There needs to be network address settings or changes to how data might be trunked, and all of those changes would take place in the configuration of the device under the control plane. Of course, the separation of data plane and control plane is not just specific to physical devices. You might have a virtual switch or a virtual firewall that can also be separated into these 2 different planes. This same separation also applies to cloud-based security controls. For zero trust, we not only need to implement additional security controls, but we need to be a lot smarter on how we evaluate those security controls. For example, we can implement a technology called adaptive identity. This is where we are examining the identity of an individual and applying security controls based on not just what the user is telling us, but other information that we're gathering about this authentication process. For example, we might want to look at the source of the requested resources. Perhaps someone who is requesting data that's located in the United States is using an IP address that's in China. And if that occurs, we may want to perform additional security to really confirm that this user is who they say they are. This might also include an examination of the relationship of this person to the organization. So are they an employee? Are they a contractor? Do they work full-time or part-time? And of course, all of this goes into the evaluation of this authentication process. We also want to look at things like physical location, the type of connection that's in place, IP addresses, and anything else that can help us identify information about this user. Once we examine all of these different variables, we can have our systems automatically create a stronger authentication if it's needed in this particular case. Another way to control this trust is to limit how many places can be used to get into the network. So you may want to limit entry points to only being people that are inside of the building or connecting through a VPN. There may be no other methods to gain access to this particular network. And once you have all of this information in place, we can now start creating what's called a policy-driven access control that examines all of these individual data points, puts them all together, and then decides what type of authentication process should be used to truly understand if the person trying to identify themselves is really that person. Another good way to qualify the identity of a person is to understand where they're connecting from. And very broadly, we categorize these as security zones. This allows us to expand from something that is simply a one-to-one relationship where a user is logging into a server and instead looks at the overall path of the conversation. These security zones look at where we're connecting from and examine where we're trying to connect to. So this may be on an untrusted network and we're trying to connect to a trusted network, or maybe it's an internal network or external network. And if you wanted to have even more granularity, you could create separate VPN connections or separate groups of different departments within your organization. This allows you to now start setting rules on what zone has access to all of the other zones. For example, you might want to have a rule that automatically denies access if someone is coming from an untrusted zone and trying to communicate to a device that's in a trusted zone. We can also use these zones to create an implicit trust. For example, if someone is in our corporate offices, they might be in a trusted zone. This user in the trusted zone may be accessing data on a database server that's in our data center, and the data center exists in the internal zone. This might allow us to create some policies that says if anyone's communicating from the trusted zone to the internal zone, that portion of the communication is implicitly trusted. To be able to set these policies and procedures along this pathway, we need to have something in place that allows us to create an enforcement of these policies. This is our policy enforcement point, and any subjects and systems that are communicating through this network will be subject to evaluation by the policy enforcement point. These subjects and systems commonly are end users, their individual processes running on a system, or they may be applications that are in use. You can think of this policy enforcement point as a gatekeeper. All of the traffic traversing the network must pass through the policy enforcement point so that we can make decisions on whether we would like to allow or disallow this traffic. And although this policy enforcement point is shown as a very broad abstraction in this diagram, you can think of this as multiple devices working together to be able to provide identification of the users and the traffic. The policy enforcement point doesn't provide the decision on whether traffic should be allowed or disallowed. Instead, it gathers all of the information about the traffic and provides that to a policy decision point. This policy decision point is responsible for examining the authentication and making a decision on whether that should be allowed on the network. Your policy engine is looking at all of the requests that are coming through. It examines the request and compares it to a set of predefined security policies and then makes a decision on whether that is granted, denied, or revoked. The policy administrator's job is to take that decision and provide that information to the policy enforcement point. There may be access tokens or credentials that are created as a result of these policy decisions, and all of those credentials are then sent to the policy enforcement point using this policy administrator. Now we can put all of this together to create a single zero trust model, which starts with our subjects and systems communicating from an untrusted zone over the data plane and communicating through the policy enforcement point. If there is a policy enforcement that needs to take place, this enforcement point will provide that to the policy administrator, which then communicates to the policy engine to make the decision about whether this traffic is allowed. That result is then passed down to the policy administrator, which provides that to the policy enforcement point. And if this traffic is allowed, the policy enforcement point then provides access to this trusted zone and ultimately the enterprise resource required for examining the authentication and making a decision on whether that should be allowed on the network. Your policy engine is looking at all of the requests that are coming through. It examines the request and compares it to a set of predefined security policies and then makes a decision on whether that is granted, denied, or revoked. The policy administrator's job is to take that decision and provide that information to the policy enforcement point. There may be access tokens or credentials that are created as a result of these policy decisions that needs to take place. This enforcement point will provide that to the policy administrator, which then communicates to the policy engine to make the decision about whether this traffic is allowed. That result is then passed down to the policy administrator, which provides that to the policy enforcement point. And if this traffic is allowed, the policy enforcement point then provides access to this trusted zone and ultimately the enterprise resource requested by the subjects or the systems.
Zero trust. It's really hard. So 我们很快的看一下刚刚的那个零信任的权限控制流程是什么。Perplexity， 我问一下这个，他是说这个 data plane 是数据流，然后会有 subject 的，就是我们把它想成是 user 好了，我们会有个 request， 然后呢给 system， 可能是我们的主机嘛，那除了这个主机外，为什么？在哪 ？OK， 看一下。那这个 policy PEP 啊，它负责的是存取控制的决策，就在这里。因为经过这个 system 的这个数据，他们都还不是一个值得信任的嘛。那我们要先通过这个 PEP， 那 PEP 呢会去告诉上一层的 PDP， 那它是 control plane， 它负责的就是做决策，会有一个引擎跟一个管理员。那引擎呢，它负责的是按照预设的规则嘛，然后制定政策，决定是否允许这个请求。那管理员就是负责做管控，发放推送政策规则给执行点。所以整个流程是subject 透过 system 发起请求，到 PEP 之后呢，这个是目前是一个不可信任的状态。那 PEP 要向 PDP 询问这个存取的决策最后结果嘛？那 PDP 呢去分析，这个引擎去看能不能请求，然后呢管理员去下达一个指令给 PEP， 所以最后呢 PEP 就根据这个决策去判断说要不要去允许或拒绝。
Subjects and systems communicate planes of operation.
前面这里还好。
Data might be trunked, and all of those changes would take place in the configuration of the device under the control plane. Of course, this separates those security controls. Are they a contractor that does to this particular network, and instead looks at different departments within, and the data center exists in the
今天我只想看到这里，前面有些无聊。所以 CIA 嘛，这是很基础的，就一定要知道的嘛。机密性、完整性跟可用性。可用性就是你随时都要可以用嘛，我们希望用户可以随时去存取。那完整性就是我们希望这个资料不会被篡改，未经授权的篡改。那机密性就是不会被未经授权人存取，所以我们才会有加密嘛。那篡改这边就是用 杂凑啊或数位签章。那什么是数位签章呢？刚刚我们有看到说，它其实会用 hash。那我们会先把原始的资料用 hash 转成一个固定长度的，然后接下来我们会用私钥去做加密，那我们就形成了一个数位签章。再来是传给接收者，那接收者收到后呢，可以用 hash 把原来的资料变成继续把它解开嘛。那再来是用签章，那刚刚的它是用私钥去加密，那我们现在可以拿刚刚发送过来的那个人他的 public key 去把它解密，得到原来的值，然后去比对两个杂凑，一样的话就是没有被篡改。那 A 跟 A 呢，3A 嘛，一个是身份验证，一个是授权，再一个是 accounting 是做什么吧，就是集合。好，所以第一个是身份认证嘛，看你的身份，那可能会有多因子认证。授权呢，就是你有什么样的权限去做什么样的事情啊？我认为就是角色啊，你的角色是什么？那你会有什么样的东西是可以让你操作的？这样 ，accounting 就是集合，那就 log 之类的，对，还好。那 CA 呢是一个第三方组织，它去发凭证。这个金钥的真实性跟合法性。Gap analysis 则是一个分析现况跟目标之间差距的方法。我们评估说我们要怎么做，我们要怎么去达到我们的目标。我觉得它不像是一个概念，所以这边我觉得都还好。还有好多啊，慢慢来。